Okay, so let's start with a little conversation about sexual behavior in adolescence. Now, just to clarify, adolescence begins with puberty and then extends for some amount of time. And I'm laughing a little bit about the definition because it's generally been assumed that adolescence ends when social independence begins. And so mid 20th century, that was kind of roughly defined as about 18 when you became, an autonomous adult. It might have been even as late as 21 because for a long time there were laws that required children to stay home until they were 21 years old, helping out with the farm, other kinds of things. So you really didn't gain your autonomy until you were 21. But with the Vietnam draft and the World War II draft, where they were drafting 18-year-olds, there was really a push to define adulthood as, the age at which you could be drafted. And then they changed the age to vote from 21 to 18, so that because they're like, if I can be drafted, I should be able to vote on my leaders. And so they pushed it down to 18. However, I think in practice, it's been really common for us to not really gain our adult autonomy until we were probably 21 or older. A lot of us, we're still largely dependent on our parents during that age. Some of you might be experiencing that right now. And so it's kind of hard to say exactly when adolescence ends if we're going to use independent autonomy as the definition. So a lot of researchers have decided that adolescence ends when high school ends. So for most of us, it's 17 or 18 years old, and then that sort of is when adolescence ends as far as psychology, and that there's a special new age called emerging adulthood that is 18 to 25. So when I talk about adolescence, in my mind as a psychologist, I'm defining it as from the start of puberty, which is all those biological changes, up until pretty much exiting high school is sort of what we're talking about. And we'll talk in this chapter about the special situations of emerging adults, the 18 to 25-year-olds. So here we have children who are maybe going through puberty at the moment, or are right on the brink of it, and they may have crushes on other people. Things to know about early crushes is that a lot of times what is characteristic of these kinds of crushes is that it's really an idealization of somebody who's roughly their peer, somebody who's pretty close in age, somebody who maybe they see on TV or YouTube or something like that, or somebody who they actually come in contact with at school. But a lot of times crushes are, the target of a crush is somebody that the individual doesn't really know that well. And so they're sort of projecting onto them. Ooh, that was a Freudian term, just FYI, right? That's one of those defense mechanisms I alluded to a few lectures ago. So they're projecting onto their peer all the things that they would like their love object to have, right? All the characteristics. And so they assume things about the peer that may or may not actually be true about them, but that the observer really wants them to have. So it's this idealization, it's not based on actual fact. Something that's really important to note about early crushes is that the target of all of this idealization and crush feelings could be either sex. It doesn't really say anything about the person's long-term sexual orientation. These are just early sort of proto-romantic feelings, right? This is a person who, a child really, who doesn't really know exactly what it means to, have a crush or be in love. They don't really know what it means, but they just have all sort of these feelings. So it could be either sex without having any impact on their later sexual orientation, or it could be even a relative, somebody who's completely not appropriate because you're related to them. But relatives oftentimes can be the target because they are, a lot of times they'll be an older relative, right? Like a young niece might idealize her uncle and just think, that someday when she grows up, she's going to marry him or something like that. I'm telling that story because I was completely going to marry my uncle. He was the greatest. I thought he was so cool. He was, now that I know more about age differences and stuff. He was only 3 years younger than my mom, but he just seems so cool and just so young and hip and stuff. Cause he was a bachelor and, my mom had me reasonably young. She was only 22 when she had me. So, my uncle just seemed to me like, just really cool. He was a hippie. He had like a long beard and he drove a Volkswagen that he had shipped back from his study abroad in Sweden year. And I mean, just all these things that I thought were so cool. Him and all of his friends got together and had a gourd ranch out in the countryside in California. And it was just like everything he did, I thought was the neatest thing. And so, I was going to grow up and marry him. There are so many things wrong with my crush, right? I mean, he's my uncle for one thing. So you're not supposed to grow up and marry your uncle. That's for sure. He's 19 years older than me. He's not supposed to necessarily marry somebody 19 years older than you. And probably really the linchpin to what was all completely wrong with my attraction to him was that he was gay. So that really, I was not his target audience, that's for sure. But the crush that I felt towards him was not based on any kind of real thing. As a 10, 11, 12-year-old, I was just sort of like looking up to him as, like everything that he did, I thought was just so admirable and cool. And I just loved everything about him. And so, so I'm kind of laughing as I tell the story because I definitely had that kind of crush. I saw it in my nieces. They're my nieces by marriage because, when I started dating their uncle, my husband, they did not care for that because they were going to marry Uncle Pat. They were definitely irritated when I showed up, that's for sure. And it was really cute to see it because, you see this kind of early crush. And actually, my nephew has expressed that when he was young, he thought that my husband was like Superman. All the nieces and nephews just thought he was all that in a bag of chips, man. And so it's really, really common. I mean, I don't think my nephew would characterize his feelings as like romantic feelings towards my husband. And I don't think the nieces would even really want to say that that's how they felt about it necessarily. But all of them just sort of idealized my husband, their uncle, right? And that's really, really common. It's really common to, go away to camp, go away to summer camp, and somebody maybe of your same sex but seems to just be so like all the things that you like or you think you would like or whatever. And so you may develop a crush on this person, regardless of their sex. They might be your same sex and you're, for the rest of your life, you're attracted to people of the other sex. But in this context, you had like this crush on this person. And it's really, really common. We oftentimes diminish these crushes that we see younger people having as, puppy love. We kind of will maybe even patronize the person who's experiencing these feelings as if, well, you'll know when you get older. And we say things to them that aren't necessarily, as sensitive as they could be because we know as adults, well, that's just a crush and you'll get over this. It's just, the passion of being a, person going through puberty or something. But it does, when the other person doesn't return their feelings, it can hurt really, really deeply, right? They think they're having all this passion towards the person and the other person is like, oh, you're just a kid. And they're like, right? Like it hurts. And so it wouldn't be called a crush if it didn't involve some pain, right? Because when it doesn't pan out, which it doesn't, 99.9% of the time it doesn't pan out, it hurts. It hurts the person's feelings. But this is the beginning of trying to figure out what it means to have these kind of, strong feelings. All right, now let's get into some actual sexual behavior, not just sort of psychological feelings. How about let's start with the most popular sexual behavior in adolescence, which is masturbation. So there's a survey of 14 to 17-year-olds that was conducted in 2010, and 2020 is the year when the new one should be coming out, and I'm kind of skeptical that it's going to be coming out, given the COVID situation and everything. I searched the Kinsey Institute to see if they had released the new national survey, and so far the data is not out. So we're just going to have to bear with the fact that my data is 10 years old. But the good news is I've been doing this class since I think I told you guys 1992. And the data on these things don't really change significantly. I mean, there's a little bit of movement here or there, but mostly the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior has been very consistent in their surveys of 14 to 17-year-olds. So we're talking about 14 to 17-year-olds. These are people who almost all have gone through puberty. There's, maybe 5% of each sex that have not. But we're looking at a vast majority of, sexually mature people. 74% of the males in the survey reported that they masturbate. 48% of the females reported that they did. And this is, again, really very consistent with what we've been seeing across infancy and childhood, that just on average, males are much more likely to masturbate than females are. There's a lot of explanations for why that is. One of the simplest explanations is just that, males see their penis, they handle their penis, they're just much more familiar with it. It becomes engorged with blood sort of spontaneously. And so it's much more likely that they would, notice it, feel things, be attracted to touching it, things like that on average, females don't have a lot of that same experience. And so they are less likely to just start doing self-exploration. And so that may be one of the reasons why, probably the most prominent reason why females are less likely to masturbate than males. Then we have to throw in the possibility that females are underreporting. Probably both sexes are underreporting masturbation. And there's actually research on what people actually hear when they're asked about whether they masturbate or not. Because apparently different people mean different things by that word. And so they might be saying no, because in their mind, they're saying, well, I've never reached orgasm through self-stimulation or something like that. Or a female might be thinking to themselves, no, I've never used a dildo, and not realizing that, you don't have to do that. I mean, there's all sorts of any kind of pleasurable touching would be categorized as masturbation. So a lot of researchers are trying to figure out if maybe people are misinterpreting what the word means, and that might account for some of the underrepresentation. One way or another, we kind of are suspicious that, only 74% of males have masturbated, when, most male infants have had erections. We have data on that. So we're like, it just seems like both of these numbers are probably underreports. How about oral sex? This was a big thing back in the 90s when it was revealed that Monica Lewinsky had performed fellatio on Bill Clinton. They were talking on the radio, on the news about, Bill Clinton had basically said he had never had sexual relations with that woman, Monica Lewinsky. And so he said, well, I wasn't lying, because when I said sexual relations, I meant coitus, basically. He used a different phrase, but I'll say coitus. And so that started a whole debate over what is actually sex. And back in the 90s, most people were agreeing that oral sex was sex. And then following this 1998 revelation and Bill Clinton talking about it the way that he did, suddenly people were like, oh, no, it's just foreplay. It's not really sex. And but what was interesting about it is that it sort of put oral sex into the discussion. And so that, parents had to define what oral sex was. And that was a fun time for parents as their kids are listening to the news and then going, Mommy, what's oral sex? And some parents would try and delay having to discuss it by saying things like, oh, it's when you talk about sex, just that's not helpful. But so a lot of kids found out what it was, in fact, through their parents or from the news. And so suddenly this is one statistic that has actually changed. From 2000 to 2010, we're seeing that there is a growing majority of teens. It had always been more than 50% of teens approved of oral sex, but it has gotten to be more like 75% of teens approve of oral sex. According to the 2010 survey, 14% of males report that they have performed oral sex, and 24% of males report that they have received oral sex. 22% of females report that they have performed oral sex, and 19% of females say that they have received oral sex. A lot of times when my students see these numbers, they assume that the same males must be having this, these kind of sexual activities with these same females. You got to remember that on average, females are having sexual contact with males who are older than them on average. And then the males are having sexual contact with females who are younger than this. So we're not talking about the same people having sex with each other. That's why these numbers don't line up. Like you would expect that, if these were males and females in partnerships or something, then the males should be saying the same number of given oral sex as the females are saying received. And the fact that it doesn't match up shows that they aren't with each other. That's for sure. But what you're seeing is that the majority of teens approve of it. Still a minority is engaging in it, right? By 17 years old, we're still seeing that not not that many teenagers have actually engaged in oral sex, either as the person who performs it or the person who receives it. Now, here's a dangerous misconception that teenagers have. They see it as less dangerous than coitus. And I mean, they're right in the sense that you can't get pregnant from it. So that does remove one, dramatic danger. But it is absolutely possible to contract STDs or STIs, however you want to call it, sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections. Absolutely can be caught through oral sex. And so the idea that it's not safe sex in all ways. And so it's a little bit risky that they have this misconception that, it is less dangerous than coitus. It is not danger free. Let's just put it that way. Now they're right. If all you've engaged in is oral sex and you think coitus is the definition of virginity, then yes, it would maintain your virginity. That's true. But I would like to point out that, looking at coitus as the only definition of virginity is a little bit antiquated, right? Because, engaging in any sex act is moving you toward more and more knowledge and things like that. So it doesn't keep you, let's say innocent, right? It doesn't keep you, unaware of sexuality if you're engaging in oral sex. That's for sure. It does allow you to avoid pregnancy. That's right. A lot of them believe that you can't contract an STI through oral sex, and that is absolutely faulty. You can contract the bacterial types of STIs for sure. Some of the viral types you can contract through oral sex. So it's definitely not risk-free. We'll talk about that more when we get to STIs. All right, so let's get to coitus. So this is kind of a fun one. And you guys, if you did the Kinsey scale at the very beginning of the class, that was one of the questions. And there's actually a range of answers to that question because, the average age is for males about 16.9. So if a person answered something like 16 or 17, I would consider that a correct answer on the Kinsey test. It's 17.4 for females. And again, this is from that 2014 data. The percent who have had first coitus. Now this is cumulative data. So the lines have to go up to the right, obviously, because we're adding the 15-year-olds who have had coitus to the 16-year-olds who have had coitus, and that's why that number is higher. By 16, 40% of females and about 38% of males report that they've had coitus. By 22 to 24, 90% of females and 89% of males, something like that, report that they've had coitus. So it's kind of a misleading thing in high school that kids will talk about like everybody's doing it and things like that. The truth is, at 18, which is, the average age when kids graduate from high school, they're somewhere between 17 and 19 usually. By 18, 70% of females and just over 60% of males have had first coitus. So it's not as common as you might think for teenagers to have sex while they're still in high school. The number has actually gone down. It used to be a slightly higher percentage of high school seniors who had had first intercourse. It's been going down over the past 40 years. So I think I might have mentioned this in an earlier chapter, but I'll repeat it because I think it bears repeating. One of the things that has happened thanks to HIV is that, really strong messages have been conveyed about, the risks associated with coitus, right, of contracting diseases, but also people have really been focusing in on the emotional side of coitus, and, that there are other behaviors that lead up to and could be enjoyed and be pleasurable that are not coitus. And so teenagers now are engaging more in oral sex than they used to. They're engaging in more, manual stimulation and other kinds of things up to and stopping short of coitus. So that has been contributing to a reduction in the percentage of high school seniors who report that they've had first coitus. And it's been, kind of helpful in a lot of ways. We'll get to that in a little bit later. I think we're going to talk about, delaying onset of intercourse being a benefit for delaying, unplanned pregnancies and things like that also. So yeah, age at first intercourse has actually gone up. When I first started teaching this class in 1992, the average age for males was less than 16, and the average age for females was about 16 and a half. So over the 30 years I've been teaching this class practically, those numbers have definitely changed. So, all right. I think that's a good time to stop, and we will come back in the next segment and talk about sex education.